Let me introduce you to Dr. Alan Krohn, that gave me an enormous amount of pleasure. I had known him for many years from Ann Arbor, Michigan, where we worked together at the university. He is a very distinguished analyst. He's the author of a book by the same title that you, of the paper that you have read, Hysteria, an Elusive Neurosis, or the Elusive Neurosis. And since you have read it, I don't need to tell you that that's probably one of the best summaries, more comprehensive and more in-depth studies of a particular nosological entity, which is of enormous significance in analysis. That's where analysis was born. And it, as he rightly described, there seems to have been lost nowadays, inappropriately so, because what it does is that it masks itself according to the culture and the changes in the culture in which the person belongs, and the changes in environment and in science and in mass communications, and they take from here, there, and the other place. And people then has assumed, as he rightly points out, that the disorder has disappeared. He has a rare quality of being an analyst that thinks in depth, understand analysis in depth. It's not a superficial analysis, of which unfortunately we suffer a large number. And so it's a real pleasure to have him here, and you are going to have him the whole afternoon, and I'm sure you will learn an enormous amount from him. I'm very grateful that he took the trouble to visit us and to give us this lecture. And he has been very generous. He is doing this kindly and out of the kindness of his heart, and because he is as committed to psychoanalysis as we all are. So, Dr. Krohn.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Dr. Nara. This paper is really a distillation of my book on hysteria, the same name, Hysteria, the Elusive Neurosis. And my work in this area began when I was a graduate student, and though I didn't have much of an understanding of what different types of neuroses were, the one that was the most puzzling was hysteria. I had at least a vague idea of what the other ones were, and so began a study of this subject and found myself increasingly confused. And what I've tried to do is bring some order to it and introduce kind of perspectives that, as Dr. Nara has mentioned, draws upon cross-cultural as well as psychoanalytic kind of perspectives on this. My original title for this book was Perspectives on Hysteria, but I was told that was too obsessional a title for a book on hysteria, which I think is right. And so let me just dive into this here. Hysteria, the Elusive Neurosis. I'd like to organize my presentation on hysteria around two interrelated questions. Does hysteria still exist? And if so, how can we define it and describe it? In my view, these questions require an investigation that draws on psychoanalytic, historical, and cross-cultural perspectives. It is with patients suffering from hysteria that Freud first explored the unconscious, repression, and intrapsychic conflict. First with hypnosis, and then with his directive, abreactive technique, an early form of free association, he found that patient symptoms could be understood as expressions of unacceptable desires and defenses against conscious recognition of those desires. As work with these early patients was done during the topographic phase of Freud's theory-making, conflict was conceptualized as drives that were repressed both for being unacceptable to a globally defined social self and for being too strong for immediate dissipation and ventilation by the psychic system. Both led to repression, a concept used by Freud during this period interchangeably with defense. Strangulated drives found derivative expression in conversion symptoms and in some patients anxiety as well. Unconscious defense, unconscious guilt, and signal anxiety would not be part of psychoanalytic theory until the advent of the structural theory about 25 years later. These early patients were considered hysterics really because of the presence of conversion symptoms. That is, psychological conflict is conceptualized within the topographic model, expressed through a symbolic use of the soma. Hysteria and conversion symptom formation were synonymous. With the diminishing appearance of conversion symptoms from psychoanalyst practices during the first half of the 20th century, some have contended that hysteria has disappeared. The argument goes, people became more sophisticated, the culture grew more accepting of sexuality, so hysteria no longer could exist or needed to exist. I should mention here as more than a footnote that conversion symptoms still appear fairly regularly in neurologists and internists' practices. This will become understandable later. Putting that aside for a moment, if classic conversion symptoms, hysterical fits, psychogenic paralyses, hysterical blindness, have largely disappeared from psychoanalyst offices, why should analysts even consider hysteria to be a useful diagnostic reference point? Hysteria, in my view, does continue to be a very useful concept theoretically and clinically if we broaden our understanding of it to include a truly psychoanalytic view of its underlying dynamics. In a basic sense, Freud's definition of hysteria, as distinct from conversion symptoms, was strikingly unpsychoanalytic. It was based on the prevailing definitions of Janet and Charcot that an hysteric was someone who presented conversion reactions along with some other surface behavioral traits such as passivity, emotional ability, childishness, and flirtatiousness. Through much of the 20th century, the definition of hysteria in the psychoanalytic literature continued to be based on, paradoxically, not underlying dynamics, the core of a psychoanalytic diagnostic point of view, but on surface character traits, behavior traits rather. With a few exceptions, notably Kernberg's work on borderline personality and Nahara's on obsessive-compulsive neurosis, this has been unfortunately typical of psychoanalytic nosology. It may help explain why psychoanalysis has, in effect, given up on diagnosis and focused increasingly on technique and the study of psychoanalytic process. In many papers in these areas, the underlying dynamics of a particular patient's psychopathology, from a psychoanalytic point of view, are underemphasized or completely ignored. I think psychoanalysis' abandonment of the study of diagnosis has facilitated the regression in psychiatry to neo-19th century Kreplinian diagnosis in the form of DSM diagnostic schemes. So we come to a choice point. If hysteria is just a label that refers to a person with certain surface behavioral traits and conversion symptoms, and if conversion symptoms have disappeared, why not just scrap the concept? This is an option which many clinicians have tacitly taken. A second option is to determine if there are some regularly occurring underlying dynamics that are found with some degree of consistency in certain people. Put another way, is there a type of character that we could usefully call hysterical character or hysterical personality? Considering that something called hysteria is among the oldest recorded medical conditions, it seemed to me, when I began my study of this personality type, to be presumptuous to write the epitaph of this disorder. In her History of Hysteria, Weiss described the ancient Greeks' theory that hysteria was a condition in which the uterus wanders through the body, putting pressure on various organs that then produce symptoms. Treatment involved luring the uterus back into its natural place. My position, which I will now present, is that the concept of hysteria, if approached from a comprehensively psychoanalytic point of view, has enduring value. So how to build a definition of this personality type? Hysterical personalities manifest traits and conflicts with origins during the Oedipal phase of development without significant regression to anal or oral phases. They use as their major defense the developmentally advanced defense of repression. Pre-Oedipal defenses such as projection, splitting, and the usual anal phase defenses of reaction formation, doing and undoing, isolation, and isolation of affect all occur but are infrequently employed defenses, seen under conditions of unusually great environmental stress. Though dissociation may be present, true psychotic withdrawal from reality does not occur. The hysterical personality has traversed the pre-Oedipal stages of libidinal and aggressive development generally successfully. The unconscious wishes that produce neurotic conflict within this type of personality revolve around triangular Oedipal rivalries. The conflicts revolve around forbidden or frightening wishes toward incestuous objects. More specifically, desires directed toward the mental representation of parents, often associated with childhood attitudes included in that. Although the specific nature of the intrapsychic conflict varies widely among individual cases of hysterical personality, the unconscious wishes in the male hysterical personality involve to a significant extent sexual longings for the mother, and the fear of retaliation and castration from the father for such desires. In the male hysterical personality, there's also often an emphasis on the negative Oedipal conflict, involving an unconscious wish to replace mother and have an exclusive bond with father. In female hysterical personalities, the unconscious wish involves a phallic Oedipal fantasy of replacing mother and being phallically penetrated by father and obtaining a penis child from him. In both sexes, these wishes generate fears of losing the love of, being punished by, or killed by the rival parent. Unconscious guilt over competitive and parasital wishes leads to neurotic conflict. Let me address in this context the argument that hysteria lost its need to exist because society became more accepting of sexuality. This argument ignores the simple fact that the conflicts in hysterical personalities, along with other neuroses, have less to do with sexual feelings permitted or prohibited by the culture, and much more to do with specifically incestuous sexual feelings and imagined acts, that is, sexual desires toward parents. These are just as conflictual as they ever were and are taboo in all cultures. What I have so far described begins our understanding of hysterical personality, but does not yet fully differentiate it from other types of personality organizations. So we go on to other distinguishing features. Conflict in hysterical personalities is limited to certain areas of functioning, leaving others intact. Conflict often shows itself in close, intimate sexual relationships, while work functioning may remain intact. At times when an unconscious fantasy is invoked in a work situation, that area may be more affected and personal, romantic and sexual life less so. The hysterical personality does not show the pervasive dysfunction of ego and superego pathology seen in borderline, psychotic, and character disordered patients, in whom virtually no area of life is unaffected by psychopathology. The ego of the hysterical personality is crucial to our understanding of it. The ego has undergone substantial, successful development in early life. Though certain ego capacities are inhibited and others hypertrophied, the ego structure is not seriously distorted. Ego structure, indeed the whole personality, the hysterical personality, is close to what is considered normal or healthy. The hysterical personality is capable of solid secondary process thinking and operates under its principles most of the time. Under the pressure of affect-laden situations, or when an unconscious fantasy is provoked, there's a tendency to turn away from logical, cause and effect thinking and toward global, impressionistic, and vague thinking. These aspects of cognition are part of a repressive style, a style that centers on not knowing. The hysterical personality is inclined toward defenses of not knowing, not seeing, and not recognizing. Repression, sudden blocking of thoughts, association, and more subtle dissociative trends, and hysterical denial. Hysterical denial involves not seeing some aspect of a situation or person, such as those traits in a potential partner that do not accord with an Oedipal fantasy of the ideal father or mother, or not seeing some problematic aspect of an object in order to play out some self-punitive need under the auspices of the superego. Another dominant defense is displacement, as the hysterical personality is commonly struggling to establish a fantasy tie to an incestuous object while avoiding taboos and imagined retaliations. Displacement is a suitable defense. An object is sought that has some qualities of the tabooed object or is in some way associated with that object, so that childhood desires are played out more safely with that person. To avoid loss of love, the hysterical personality employs another defense, variously described as living vicariously, having a pseudo-self, or enlarging self-boundaries to include a libidinal object. These are the many sides of the hysterical tendency toward identification. The underlying need in doing so can be guilt over wishes to displace a rival parent, or a desire to be more attractive by assuming qualities perceived in the desired object, or for some other intrapsychic purpose. A few more aspects of the ego that are characteristic expressions of repression. Pseudo-stupidity and naivete are character defenses that serve to avoid thinking unacceptable thoughts. Being dramatic, melodramatic, and flamboyant are commonly seen character traits that are in the service of the defensive proclamation, what I feel and what you observe in me is not me, it is a role. Being dramatic also contains the defensive use of an exaggerated form of an emotion to defend against the direct, much more heartfelt, non-dramatized experience of that same emotion. A big show of sadness may defend against a very painful experience of sadness of normal proportions. Though embedded in what I've been saying, let me turn more directly to the nature of relationships and hysterical personalities. The hysterical person expects relationships to conform to unconscious, infantile, fairy tale images of love and romance, and grows depressed, angry, or disengaged when an object fails to measure up to these fantasies. There is often a phase in forming relationships during which the hysterical personality, through hysterical denial, dissociation, or narrowed wish-fulfilling cognition, manages not to see aspects of the object that do not correspond to the fantasy. With time, the object's reality becomes undeniable, and its lack of congruence with the infantile images causes serious disappointment. This is all in contrast to more disturbed people, such as borderlines, who never have the capacity for accurate perceptions of other people. Hysterical personalities' perceptions of others are anchored by basically stable, relatively differentiated, and multifaceted object representations. Object images are not fluid or preambivalently split as in borderline personalities. They are not subject to the intense love-hate ambivalence seen in anal characters and obsessive-compulsive personalities. While objects may be idealized as part of an attempt to sustain the illusion that an infantile object has been found, there is fundamentally a rich spectrum of object representations available to the ego. Consistent with relatively advanced development, there is a capacity for basic trust. There is also object constant as distinct from need-satisfying object relations, as described by Freiberg. To fully understand the nature of internalized object relations and actual relationships formed by hysterical personalities, you must have a thorough understanding of the Oedipus complex. Here, I'll be able only briefly to explore this, as a thorough understanding of this complex, of this core complex, is, of course, a vast subject in itself. The hysterical personality pursues a relationship patterned on unconscious wishes toward parents that have characteristics of a child's experience of them during the Oedipal phase. The object and the relationship in adult life to the object must conform to an often complex and specific set of unconscious requirements. The hysterical personality is in pursuit of a relationship with certain qualities patterned on unconsciously remembered Oedipal phase constructions of parents' relationship with each other. These constructions are much more specific than constructions of relationships with origins in earlier development. The unconscious Oedipal fantasy involves, of course, competition and death wishes with one parent for the prize of an exclusive relationship with the other. The fantasies include images of a powerful prince or king attaining the exclusive love of an idealized princess or queen. There are also images of the competitor as bad as in the wicked queen or stepmother. From a clinical point of view, this fairy tale quality of internalized relationships and actual relationships is often one of the first signs that one is dealing with an hysterical personality. Many relationships are viewed as competitions, if not battles, with someone for possession of the love object. The competition is to be the most phallically superior or admired, to be the one to be looked upon as the strongest, smartest, or most beautiful. The object sought is often viewed as a prize or trophy. It is often experienced as taboo, off-limits, or forbidden. A pattern of repeated relationships with unavailable objects, such as married men or women, is common. The unavailability represents the unconscious incestuous significance of the object. Once the object is attained, there is commonly a loss of interest in him or her. The object is no longer unattainable, and therefore ceases to be experienced as the desired Oedipal object. In some hysterical personalities, to defend against awareness of the Oedipal desires, objects are sought that are either Madonnas or whores, but not both, as Freud described. For women, the comparable syndrome is to have sexual feelings for the bad boys, while affectionate and loving, but non-sexual feelings are directed toward the responsible, less flashy men. As well, the experience of objects and wishes directed toward others have the imprint of the outlook of a 3 to 6-year-old child. While I've emphasized the relatively developmentally advanced nature of hysterical personalities, We must keep in mind that the fixations they evidence are still from ages 3 to 6, much before true genitality and the more mature, differentiated understanding of relationships associated with latency, adolescence, no less adulthood. I want to stress that to fully understand an individual patient with hysterical personality demands a thorough understanding of the Oedipus complex as it plays itself out in a particular patient. Such dimensions as the active or passive nature of the phallic Oedipal phase strivings, or the relative importance of positive versus negative Oedipal dynamics, will determine object choice, the nature of the desires toward the object, desired sexual practices, self-image, among many other things. Understanding hysterical personality means understanding the Oedipus complex in all its variations. In my book, I spell out the ways these specific variations manifest themselves in constellations of behavior, object choice, and neurotic conflict. But unfortunately, I cannot cover all of this here. All along, I've been alluding to how the hysterical personality is different from the borderline and more disturbed personalities. It is also useful briefly to comment on the differences between the hysterical personality and the other major neurotic constellation, the obsessive-compulsive personality. The whole stance of the hysterical personality is to use defenses that take the self out of the locus of control of thoughts and feelings. The character style revolves around feeling oneself the victim of something that has overtaken and directed the self. This is possible because developmentally the anal phase needs for hyper-control of the self and willful domination over others have been fairly well left behind. In the obsessive-compulsive personality, there are, in contrast, powerful needs to feel in control of much that is not inherently controllable: emotions, especially anal sadistic ones, the dangers of the world, and the actions of others. So the obsessive-compulsive is seeking through magical thinking, ritualistic behavior, and other defensive means to play out a desire on the level of the self, to feel all is somehow under the control of the self. The hysterical personality is very willing to consciously feel submissive to forces outside his or her control, but unconsciously may be enacting very active desires. While the obsessive-compulsive personality is seeking to feel in control of that which is not controllable, such as danger, injury, loss, death, or the surging of his or her own aggressive, sadistic impulses. There are also struggles around narcissism in the hysterical personality. When problems around narcissism are discussed within psychoanalysis, there is unfortunately an inclination to assume we are discussing difficulties reflective of basic, severe pathology of object relations and self-structure development dating to the first 2 years of life. Of course, severe forms of narcissistic pathology do have these early origins, but narcissism, like libidinal development, has its own line of development in Anna Freud's sense. There are aspects of phallic narcissism described by Annie Reich that bear on our understanding of hysterical personality. In hysterical personalities, there is often an unconscious knowledge dating to the Oedipal phase that even if the Oedipal battle is won, the self is still a 3 to 6 year old child, smaller, weaker, less physically and sexually endowed than adults. Many female hysterical personalities feel they are not pretty enough or smart enough to be with an adult man. They often feel unconsciously to be little girls. Male hysterical personalities feel they are not strong enough with big enough penises to satisfy adult women. There are often compensatory efforts arising from these narcissistic dynamics. In men needing to show off by flaunting power, money, sexual desirability, or sexual exploits. In women, becoming preoccupied with looks, clothes, and collecting signs of being attractive to men. The diminished, injured sense of the self can, of course, sit side by side with compensatory inflations of the self's power and sexual attributes. The superego in the hysterical personality has a basic integrity, neither rigid nor uncompromising. It lacks the moral masochism and self-directed sadism seen in obsessive-compulsive personalities. As the concept of the superego can be amended and altered in accord with what is pleasing to certain important objects, it can appear to be weak. At its core, however, such people's attitudes and behavior are governed by a fairly high adherence to the dictates of their conscience. Part of the reason for basically high moral functioning is that they are generally advanced level of object representations, brings with it empathy for others, which in turn brings with it moral imperatives. A decided weakness in the superego of the hysterical personality arises from the need to sustain the illusion that responsibility and accountability are in the hands of another person or some force outside the self. It is this quality of the hysterical ego to which I will now turn. What I have described so far takes us quite a way to defining hysterical personality and understanding its underlying dynamics. But to fully understand a key aspect of ego functioning and overall personality organization in this type of personality, we must return to where we started, to the problem of the relationship between hysterical personality and conversion symptoms, and why conversion symptoms are rarely seen these days in analysts' offices. To address this problem, we must step back and approach hysterical personality historically and cross-culturally. We must understand the way the ego in the hysterical personality uses the forms of his or her own culture. When considered within a particular culture, the definition of hysteria remains elusive because the definition rests largely on the way in which this personality type uses cultural forms, regardless of the culture's specific content of these forms. The hysterical personality uses the dominant forms of his or her culture in a particular way to resolve conflict. Hysterical personality therefore assumes as wide a variety of overt forms as there are variations among cultures. Only when hysterical personality is viewed in its many specific manifestations across cultures do its common, basic structural features emerge. Hysterical personality can be defined as a personality type that plays out dominant, current cultural identities, often to a marginal but never to a socially alienating extreme, in an attempt to promote an illusion of passivity. Though its overt forms have changed, its essential structural properties and unconscious conflicts have endured. The illusion of passivity refers to an attempt to disown, both internally and interpersonally, responsibility in the broadest sense for thoughts, acts, and impulses. The hysterical personality promotes a sense within himself that he did not actively choose to have certain feelings, to make certain choices, or to entertain certain thoughts. So in some cultures, spiritual forces, not the personal will, are considered responsible for personal acts, choices, or desires. In other cultures, the play of physical, biological, or even psychological forces are used by the hysterical person to explain and disown a wish or act. Let's turn now to some historical and cross-cultural examples of hysterical personality. First, the victims of witchcraft, mostly women. The victims of witchcraft, quote-unquote victims of witchcraft, in both New England and earlier in Europe, participated in prevailing myths of their cultures, myths that the devil or witch could wrest control of the body and mind and use it for their own purposes. The bewitched was not to be held responsible for her behavior, for she was the unwilling victim of the will of another. The fits, anesthesias, and spells suffered by the victims were not the victims, but the devil's doing. The victim could also disown her wishes to gain support, sympathy, and attention. In Salem, many of these victims were adolescent girls who claimed older women were witches. We can speculate about the Oedipal strivings that work in these girls, strivings that could be disowned through the illusion of passivity fostered by their culture's sacred beliefs. The Apache shaman is another example. The Apache shaman demonstrates how adaptive the hysterical resolution can be. The duties of the shaman include making contact with ghosts and spirits for others in the culture. The Apache belief is that shamans are recruited during adolescence by homeless spirits. The shaman sees himself as an emissary to the spirit world, capable of calling upon and mediating between sources of awesome and frightening power and people in his culture, while paradoxically being himself a relatively powerless usher or channeler of such wonders. Similar to the witchcraft victim, the shaman is not himself responsible for the powers that work through him, but he may command awe and respect for being the vessel that can hold these forces and rid someone suffering from some evil spirit by absorbing these toxic demons into himself. The forces themselves are not his. He feels himself to be passive to forces that work through him. Now to Freud's hysterics, the Victorian ones. To fully understand Victorian hysteria in the United States or Europe, especially in females, demands an analysis of the cultural and social strains on women during that era. I discuss this in my book, but time will limit the extent of my discussion of the full topic here. I will deal here then with only a few of the roots of Victorian hysteria. The Victorian hysterical personalities used conversion symptoms. As is typical of hysterical personalities, she expressed her conflicts using a set of ideas that were coming into their own in her culture. In this case, the culture's new view of the body. With the ascendance of the germ theory in the second half of the 19th century, the culture was taken with the notion that something could invade the body and make it sick. As well, drawing on social expectations that a woman should seem passive and weak, it was considered natural that a woman would get sick and, quote, take to bed, instead of acknowledging that she had some unwelcome wishes or desires. To love or hate strongly and overtly were close to impossible for the Victorian woman. To be weak and sick, however, were considered basic to feminine nature. To fall ill became one of the few ways within the limits of Victorian convention through which a woman could express inner passions and conflicts. Of course, outside the limits of convention, a psychotic or schizoid personality, as in every culture, expressed his or her response to conflict by the standards of the culture much more deviantly. Due probably to the advances in the study of disease, and to the growing secularization of the culture, concern with vulnerability to disease replaced earlier fears of divine vengeance. These are not my hatreds, loves, or ambivalences, but owing to the disease that has overtaken me, was the ego attitude of the Victorian hysterical personality. It was a solution which, in characteristic hysterical fashion, remained solidly within the limits of propriety and conventionality, and at the same time aroused enough concern merited by one who is ill, to enlist the attention of people from whom to receive and toward whom to express in disguised forms the loves and hatreds unacceptable in the Victorian woman. Illness in the form of conversion reactions became a symbolic way by which tabooed thoughts, feelings, and wishes could be disowned and through the body symbolically expressed. Unraveling these symbols and tracing their roots in the hysteric's history was, of course, one of Freud's first psychoanalytic accomplishments. Modern psychiatry and psychoanalysis were misled by Victorian hysterical personality's use of somatization. Both fields generalized from the Victorian hysterical personality's use of conversion, considering hysteria to be virtually the same as conversion. The Victorian hysteric, with her conversion reactions, was modern psychiatry's first exposure to hysteria, an historical accident that had some unfortunate consequences for later thinking about the disorder. Because hysteria expressed itself as mock disease during that period, the disorder came to be considered implicitly or explicitly as a disease of physical symptoms of psychological origin. So as the 20th century began, hysteria was known as the imitator of disease. Hysteria was conversion, and conversion was hysteria. Unfortunately, as hysteria came to assume new forms with changes in the culture, as is its very essence, the theory of hysteria, lagging behind, persisted in trying to conceptualize it as a disease of psychogenically produced physical symptoms. As conversion symptoms showed themselves with less frequency in clinical practice, some contended that hysteria was disappearing. Within psychoanalysis, Fenichel made a respectable attempt to define hysteria based on underlying dynamics, but its description was very abstract and overly focused on unconscious fantasy. Horowitz did an extensive review of the literature on hysterical personality and provided interesting case illustrations, never fully distilled, in my opinion, a clear definition of the hysterical personality organization. Over the past 100 years, hysteria has changed in accordance with changing cultural trends. In Western culture, especially women, but men as well, have been accorded greater freedom to use alloplastic active alternatives. This allowed hysteria to express itself as a pattern of life choices. With this expanded range of interpersonal action, hysterical solutions were no longer limited to the autoplastic alternative of falling ill. Hysteria ceased to express itself exclusively as a mimicry of physical disease and mapped itself out as a general pattern of personal action. With the Victorian hysteric, express feelings and thoughts unacceptable in consciousness by symbolization of body parts, the modern hysterical personality, making use of new social options, came to use the avenue of object choice and identification to express unconscious strivings and to maintain the ubiquitous hysterical illusion of passivity. For example, a female hysterical personality might unconsciously identify with qualities of her mother as seen during the Oedipal phase and choose a man with qualities associated with her picture of her father from the same phase. She might do this even if she is very different from her mother and is seeking men who are not fundamentally to her liking. During the 20th century, consistent with the essence of hysterical personality to draw upon current, in-vogue cultural modes to play out an illusion of passivity, it has continued to change its overt form. Briefly, here are a few of the incarnations of the hysterical personality. With the new social prerogatives afforded women, combined with remnants of Victorian myths of women as weak, innocent, and intellectually inferior, the first half of the 20th century witnessed the popular stereotype of the, quote, dumb blonde, who was unwittingly seductive yet psychologically, if not physically, virginal. Parts played by Marilyn Monroe epitomized this 20th century myth of the naive, childish woman. It is this American myth of feminine passivity that many 20th century hysterical personalities made part of their character style. The catalog of hysterical character traits put together by Easter and Lesser culled from the literature on hysterical character, labile emotionality, suggestibility, excitability, acting like a flighty child woman, essentially describe the stereotype. The popularization of psychology and psychoanalysis in the United States during the middle of the 20th century led to another version of hysteria. Just as the scientific study of physical disease in the 19th century supplied metaphors which led to the experience within the hysterical personality that her body was overtaking her with physical symptoms, so with discoveries of Freud that thoughts, feelings, and motivations can influence us, the hysterical personality came to feel, I am the passive victim of my feelings, a victim of a popularized idea of the unconscious. Just as she had been prey to the wandering uterus in ancient Egypt, or the power of the devil or witch in the Middle Ages, or physical disease during the Victorian era, now she could experience herself as passive in relation to psychological forces outside her control. Rather than resorting to illness, such as conversion or invalidism, to disown and at the same time express, for example, her resentment, she could now express and disavow such feelings by claiming to others and herself that, quote, the feelings just came over me. I don't know what happened. All of a sudden I was overtaken by my emotions. In short, she was now the victim of her psyche, as in other times she had been at the mercy of spirits or disease. In all these cases, we need to keep in mind that this all functions to play out underlying struggles of a mostly Oedipal nature. Some even more current expressions of the hysterical ego attitude. During the 1960s, the hysterical ego attitude was that feelings, actions, and thoughts were the sole result of social and political forces. Other myths of passivity of that decade were passivity to one's diet, you are what you eat. In the last 10 years or so, there's been a tendency for hysterical personalities to feel passive to one of many syndromes, some medical, some psychological. Feeling oneself to be the passive victim of complexes described in self-help books, such as the Cinderella complex, or being the victim of an addiction, such as a sex addiction, or any of a vast variety of other so-called addictions. Chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia may be genuine medical conditions. In hysterical personalities, they can be unconsciously mimicked. While some people with eating disorders have very severe oral phase struggles with separation anxiety at the core, others are hysterical. Page problem here. Here we go. Others are hysterical personalities. Let me read that sentence again. While some people with eating disorders have very severe oral phase struggles with separation anxiety at the core, others are hysterical personalities who are unconsciously mimicking the syndrome, using it to play out Oedipal level dynamics. Or just as some people have genuine multiple personality disorders, when that diagnosis became widely discussed or written about, there emerged a small army of people with this problem. Real multiple personality disorders do exist, but they are, as they have always been, rare. So here again, the hysterical person has this syndrome to play out his or her intrapsychic conflicts, most of which are Oedipal in nature. Another current form of hysterical ego attitude, of defensive passivity, is to feel that everything one does or is the result of one's genes. Because major new discoveries are being made about the role of genes in the formation of our physical and psychological selves, a current hysterical personality can toss off responsibility for some wish or action with, I guess it's just my genes. The popularization of stress has provided raw material for another current hysterical character attitude. Instead of facing internal wishes or desires, the hysterical personality can feel obsessed by stressors. An hysterical personality I treat spoke of his mother-in-law's constant phone calling to his wife being, quote, a stressor in my life. He was feeling himself to be the passive victim of her behavior rather than facing his impulses toward her, connected in many ways with his hostile feelings, including death wishes, toward his own emotionally eruptive, intrusive mother. By not facing these feelings, he was inclined unconsciously to act out an identification with his mother by being loud and intrusive with his wife and children. Related to this is the character defensive position that what the self feels or does is the result of trauma and abuse. Again, there are many people who have been traumatized and abused, but the hysterical personality unconsciously enacts this as a character defense. The sense of being the victim of trauma is connected with another modern form of hysteria, the recovered memory craze. The patient submits to and joins with a therapist's notion that a traumatic experience is making him or her sick. Again, this is actually true of some, probably small group of patients, but in hysterical personalities, as recovery memory treatment has been written about in magazines and discussed on TV, it becomes a cultural phenomenon unconsciously fashioned into a myth of passivity. A variant of this is the fantasy of being victimized by people performing satanic rituals. Some people who claim this are, of course, much more disturbed, even psychotic, but there are likely some hysterical personalities who play this fantasy out. Another current form of hysterical ego attitude views brain biology as the source of all of one's behavior and feelings. As important discoveries are made in the area of neurobiology and psychopharmacology, hysterical personalities can use these culturally current discoveries to play out his or her neurotic attitudes. What I do and feel is not really motivated by my wishes or desires. It is the result of what my brain physiology is making me do or feel. In each of these cases, these cultural currents are recruited to play out conflicts that are predominantly Oedipal in the context of an ego that uses high-level ego defenses, higher-level defenses, fairly developmentally advanced object relations, and ego and superego structural features described earlier. I said at the beginning of this presentation that it will become understandable why hysterical personalities who use conversion symptoms still appear, but now in neurologists and internists' offices. This is because in these medical contexts, a physical symptom of supposedly psychological origin still has great currency. Just as a recovered memory therapist provides an interpersonal framework for the idea that all of a patient's problems are due to some unremembered event, so a physician provides the context where symptoms may be viewed as caused by something being wrong with the brain or body. Psychoanalysts certainly, and many psychiatrists these days, as well, are less likely to assume such symptoms are physical and wonder about the motives and feelings behind them. This context threatens to unveil the underlying motivations, which is exactly what hysterical personalities in all forms are trying to avoid. Understanding the hysterical personality's use of cultural forms to play out an illusion of passivity is significant in two ways. First, it is crucial to seeing through the era and culture-specific manifestations of this hysterical personality toward the goal of defining hysterical personality universally. Second, the hysterical personality's sensitivity to new, just in vogue cultural forms reflects a quality, one might call it a strength, of the hysterical personality's ego and object relations. That is, an ability to be sensitive to what is happening in people and in the culture, and in tuneness with people and the environment, a social sense. This can be characterized as an intuitiveness about people, an awareness of style and custom, and an ability to pick up beliefs and attitudes of others. The hysterical personality's ego then goes on to craft what is picked up from the environment to make a character style, including adaptive and defensive modes of functioning. I'll now present another current example of the way the hysterical personality operates through a brief case illustration. The subtle but powerful effects of cultural stereotypes and prejudices of people based on their race, ethnicity, and religion are now being very appropriately recognized and highlighted in our society. Cultural sensitivity to these issues has been long overdue. But here again, this current focus can be recruited by hysterical personalities. A single 27-year-old female hysterical personality, a resident in pediatrics, born and raised in New York City of Indian American parents, considered virtually everything she thought, felt, or wished to be the result of others' pressure on her to behave in a particular way based on her race, ethnicity, and religion. She could avoid recognizing wishes as her own and guilt for her actions as her own. This character attitude that she could be magically taken over by or transformed by others showed itself too in feeling that if she were in the presence of people, typically men, whom she viewed as strong, their strength would somehow pass into her and make her strong. Conversely, when she had social contact with people whom she viewed as weak and passive, she couldn't stand to be in the same room with them. As we analyzed this feeling in connection with a friend whom she saw as an accommodator, a peacemaker, a timid woman, the preconscious thought rushed into her awareness and she said, "That woman will infect me with her wussiness." This patient was continually working to repair feelings of defectiveness arising from a major castration complex by continually looking for people, mostly men, from whom she could get coaching, mentoring, and guidance, even though this collided with her sense of independence and her belief in the equality of women. Her Oedipal struggles had major active phallic elements, inflamed by wishes to be her father or older brother, who had a very close relationship with each other, a tie from which she felt painfully excluded. She struggled with an unconscious belief that she was like her passive, weak, ineffective, periodically substance-abusing mother, and wished to be like her phallic phase experience of her father, as strong in his rigid authoritarian attitudes. She often acted like this image of the father with her fiancé, whom she viewed as weak and whom she needed to be weak. Later in this patient's analysis, she used a similar character defense to disown positive Oedipal competitive impulses. She talked about, the competitive atmosphere of medicine, quote, making me feel, unquote, competitive with a fellow female resident for attention of several attending doctors. As the defense was analyzed, she could remember her mean-spirited, was her word, her phrase, mean-spirited comparisons of sexual attractiveness, especially her pleasurable feelings, her schadenfreude, about the friend's acne scars. This in turn brought to mind adolescent memories of pleasure at her mother's overweight. Feeling passive to a fantasy of an idealized, imagined fairy tale relationship can be another manifestation of an hysterical ego style. This tendency, along with other features of the hysterical personality, will be illustrated in the following, more extensive case illustration of a male hysterical personality. The patient is a man in his late 30s, of medium height, muscular build, strong voice, intelligent, articulate. Originally from Toronto, he has lived in Michigan for the past 15 years. He is never married and has no children. He dresses with a studied casualness, gestures largely as he talks, seems to be striking actorly poses, and has in general a dramatic quality, illustrated by his making lying down on the couch look like a gymnastic move, with an outstretched arm locked at the elbow that he rotates around as he lies down. His day job is driving a shuttle for the university. More important to him is his evening and weekend work as a personal trainer and owner of a small gym. He has aspired to do much more with his physical training interest, such as becoming a physical education teacher, organizing exercise diet workshops, for becoming a martial arts instructor, but he's never felt he could do any of this. Though he is intelligent, articulate, and writes well, he never attended college. Though he has thought about often about going to college, something he can't describe holds him back. He remembers even as young as 8, feeling that when other kids were thinking about driving ahead in life, he was puzzled and confused as to how to do this. His life has been limited by inhibitions of ambition, achievement, and competition. Paradoxically and tellingly, he is often caught up with gauging other men's intelligence, attractiveness, and success with women, and comparing these men with himself. His body language is that of power and strength, which are, of course, very much part of his work as a personal trainer. His voice tone and behavior can be very confronting, but when I commented on this to him, he was surprised and very apologetic. He sees himself as nice, quiet, and meek. On one occasion, when a personal training client of his described him as physically formidable, he was pleased but very surprised. So he unconsciously is very phallic in his behavior and pursuits, but at the same time inhibits these and in larger areas of his life has been self-castrating. In the sports area, he was very good at basketball as a kid when playing with other kids, but at tryouts where competition was involved and adults were evaluating him, he clutched and didn't make the team. He came for analysis after a succession of relationships with women he knew were intelligent, attractive, warm, good people. Unlike some neurotic men, he makes good choices in women. The problem is that after about 3 months, he grows disappointed with each woman. He becomes aware of and preoccupied with their flaws. He then idealizes past women or possible future ones, and then gets distant and decreasingly sexual with the woman he is currently with. They end up leaving him. I'll sketch out the overdetermined meanings of this pattern as we piece them together in the analysis. No woman will ever live up to his fantasy of his mother, who he felt could. Let me read that again. No woman will ever live up to his fantasy being that his mother thought about him and felt about him, the patient, that the patient could do no wrong. If he remains uncommitted to any woman, a place is left open for his mother. He externalizes his own phallic-phased sense of having flaws, caused in part by comparison with his harsh, crude, degrading father, who is loud, combative with neighbors, and from time to time physically abusive to the patient. He continually seeks new relationships because during the courting phase, there is praise of him and excitement about him, which serves to shore up phallic narcissistic vulnerabilities. He also wants the perfectly attractive woman for the imagined admiration it would bring him in the eyes of other men. The patient is often very caught up with concerns about how he looks to others, with his experience of himself ranging from very strong and sexy to dumb and awkward, essentially castrated. In typical male hysterical fashion, the experience of himself as small and weak is at times defended against with an overinflation of the sense of self, a phallic grandiosity, along with accompanying body language. Yet when castration anxiety is ascendant within him, he will use the feeling of being small and weak to defend against competitive urges that are associated with his father's arrogant, superior, often bellicose behavior. The Oedipal wish to be like the father or to surpass him on the father's own terms, such as fantasies of defeating him in a physical fight, is fended off by feeling weak. Succeeding and excelling are unconsciously equated with physically defeating and killing his father, and therefore must be undermined. The image of the perfect woman in typical hysterical fashion is very much that of a princess, including an excessive involvement with her appearance and a fantasy that they will be continuously sexually aroused by each other. Finally, his critical attitude toward each current woman keeps him in a removed, judging position to avoid what he feels to be a feminine, babyish surrender to strong emotions. If he's the critic of the woman, he doesn't feel many strong feelings of attachment, of longing, of love for her. So all this is condensed and played out in his pattern of object disappointments. And what is so characteristically hysterical is his stance toward his problem of questing after the next or last perfect woman. He feels himself to be the passive victim of his problem, under the sway of it, a helpless victim of it. In the transference, he maintains an overtly submissive position with me that fends off Oedipal competitive strivings. He hopes that I, as his analyst, will rid him of his problem while he passively submits to the treatment. There is little real ownership of the wishes, desires, fantasies, and irrationalities contained in this quest. Another way this ego style shows itself. In one session, he spoke of his mind being so fucked up. I just can't stop this selective memory thing, that is, remembering only positive things about past failed relationships. My unconscious is just so messed up, I have no control over any of this. For brief moments, he can step back and see that it is his selective memory that makes him forget the dull or disappointing aspects of a previous woman, and also to exaggerate the good things about her. For brief moments, he can see that it is he that is doing this. But he then returns to feeling he's powerless to control it. Regularly, he'll ask me to tell him what his problems are, to go over what we've had many times discovered, and what I can do to change him. I work with him on how this question expresses a problem. He needs to disown what he is doing, feeling the problems are outside himself. I will tell him what they are while he passively listens. He doesn't own the problem, doesn't put himself behind the wheel of his own car, his own mind, his own wishes. In essence, what he does is to see things as he wishes them to be. He refuses to see that an ideal, fairy tale woman and relationship is not possible, because then he would have to recognize that it's a fantasy, his fantasy, an unrealizable fantasy, and he would have to give it up. In one session after I made this interpretation, he talked about how he keeps himself confused about what he really wants. In one session, I made this interpretation. After I made this interpretation, he talked about how he keeps himself confused about what he really feels. Unlike the clarity he thinks he'd have about his feelings, say, if his mother died. I pointed out to him that to own what he's wishing for and to realize the impossibility of his wishes is to let his larger-than-life desire for the mother he remembers as a 4-year-old die. In typical hysterical fashion, he sees himself as a little boy. As a boy passes through the phallic phase, his narcissism is assaulted by the recognition that he is not an adult man with an adult man's body and adult's rights and prerogatives. During sex, he felt from time to time that the woman was too large for him, that her body was big and his was small. The defenses against that self-experience are also typical phallic Oedipal ones. He carried his body with a 4-year-old boastfulness, a kind of swagger, like a little boy trying to look like a cartoon or comic book superhero. This was too, a phallic phase exhibitionism that showed itself in his preoccupation with how people would see and evaluate his looks, strength, and via displacement upward, his intelligence. Wanting to be seen with a beautiful woman was also, of course, both an expression of the phallic phase desire to be a strong, manly man with a princess queen mother, and a defense against his little boy experience of himself as small and weak. The underlying feeling of smallness and weakness would, however, show through in a painful self-consciousness in social situations about being seen as awkward and stupid. As with any psychopathology, a fully psychoanalytic diagnosis is made through discovery of what lines of interpretation lead to confirming data, deepening of material, or therapeutic change. A key line of interpretation with this man finally revolved around the ways his feelings of fear of being humiliated, looked down on, and injured in imagined fights were rectified and psychologically redressed by thinking of himself as a sexy man with an extremely attractive woman. Even more interesting was that the state of being sexually attracted and aroused, which he craved and which he would temporarily find with each new woman, quieted his fears of being small and scared. As we have pieced together the nature of his fantasy of the woman he seeks, it has become clear that she is like, quote, a princess in a fairy tale. That's his own phrase. How this Oedipal wish is handled by his hysterical ego is illustrated by his talking about how he is so under the sway of his, quote, princess complex, a syndrome that causes him to feel what he does. He's the victim of that syndrome in his own mind. He feels the imagined woman's attractiveness takes over and he is powerless. So he uses this illusion of passivity to avoid conscious recognition that these wishes are his, and further to avoid seeing the nature of these wishes, that they are unconscious desires for his Oedipal phase mother. To illustrate this connection to his mother, He often thought about an incident with a particular woman from his past, retrospectively idealized, of course, who on their first date intuited that he would like a particular novel that turned out to be his favorite. This was absolute magic for him. At several points in the treatment, he reported a memory of coming home from first grade and his mother asking him to come upstairs to his bedroom, where to his absolute delight she gave him a new Hardy Boys mystery which he loved. Before I pointed out the connection to him, he had no conscious recognition that the idealized woman's behavior was, in his mind, a duplicate of the memory of his mother. In the memory of the mother, you can, of course, hear the fantasy of seduction by her. This mother was not in any way inappropriate with her son. His wishes gave the screen memory its seductive sexual overtones. I should mention here that the maternally based fantasy of the ideal woman had some significant bisexual elements. Following a dream of a unicorn, there were a series of sessions in which he talked about one of the women from his past whom he longed for, who could talk about sports and other things, quote, like a guy. He said she had breasts, a vagina, and a nice body, but she was otherwise just like a guy. This seemed to me not a pre-Oedipal desire for a phallic mother, but more a disguised desire for a passive submission to the father. Another meaning of this patient's problematic relationship pattern was that as he came to know a particular woman as a person, as a companion, he would feel a decreasing amount of sexual desire for her. This is part of the Madonna whore defensive position that Freud described. When a woman is loved affectionately, quote, as a person, as the object of sexual feelings as well, this comes too close to reviving childhood Oedipal fantasies, and with it castration anxiety and other fears. So as he gets closer to a woman, he has to shut down the sexual component of his feelings toward her and look toward the next woman who he thinks about in non-companion, strictly erotic ways. This all happened in the context of a man whose ego structure and range of object representations reflected a great deal of solid development. He had outside his romantic relationships the capacity for three-dimensional views of other people. He had achieved object constancy and with it empathy. He could delay and channel impulses and had good reality testing. He also had an intact superego. He was a man of his word, played by the rules, and was true to commitments he made to others. There was an absence of primitive splitting and the oscillation between rage and oceanic feelings of love seen in borderline patients. He did not have the intense, active, passive, love-hate ambivalences seen in obsessive-compulsive people. There were no struggles with sadistic impulses toward others, and the severe self-criticism when these are turned against the self. Though he had preoccupations about how he was viewed by others, these were not concerns that reflected a primitive fear of self-disillusion or self-disintegration. In fact, we were able to get some insight into his intense self-consciousness. It had phallic exhibitionistic elements. That is, behind the fear of being seen was the wish to be seen. But even more interesting, this self-consciousness came to be understood as having a self-controlling function, which, if it were absent, he feared would open him up to being, quote, an aggressive son of a bitch like his father. It would also get me in trouble with other men, feeling I'd gone over some line in being way too confronting, unquote. So there was here a kind of counter-identification with father to fend off a more deeply repressed wish to be like him. To be like him brought up two intrapsychic problems. It risked unearthing memories of being the victim of his abuse, and more importantly, led him to fear retaliation from others for his aggressive wishes. This is classic Little Hans-type projection of aggressive, murderous wishes, and then fear of injury from the object onto whom the wishes have been projected. This patient presented continually the following resistance, which I would point out to him. Quote, the essence of it was, I can see that what you are saying is true, but what do I do with it, he would say. The analytic work was being defensively processed as me saying things to him which he passively hears, but which he avoids actively engaging and embracing. He would say, my mind or my unconscious are just so fucked up, there's nothing I can do. Leslie Farber wrote, quote, an hysteric makes sexuality out of the therapist's science, while the therapist makes science out of sexuality. In this affair, the hysteric has the advantage, there being more sex to science than vice versa. This is still true and has implications for what hysterical personalities, like the patient described, can do with a psychoanalytic situation. As psychoanalysts, we work to help patients recognize that there are forces outside their awareness and conscious control that can have enormous effects on what they do and feel. This outlook is an important component of the working alliance. It is based on Sturba's therapeutic ego split on which an analytic process depends. That process has as its ultimate aim to foster in the patient an ownership of, and to some degree control over, what is in his or her unconscious. But this notion of an unconscious that exerts control over the self can be drawn into the character, defensive, and ego-attitudinal proclivities of the hysterical personality and constitute a major resistance. In this way, the analytic situation itself can become a kind of microenvironment in which the hysterical personality can play out yet another version of itself. This character style and the defenses and ego attitudes contained in it need to be well understood by psychoanalysts and psychotherapists treating these patients. Thank you.
And again, you will understand why this book of his has become the accepted textbook on Hysteria in most institutions across the world. And you see, it's an extraordinary thought, well written, comprehensive, in-depth paper that goes through the complexities of the mind and the depths in which the mind hides many of the wishes and longings that they have in the context of early childhood. I think it's really a very beautiful paper. Maybe you have some comments or questions. Sure. It's your opportunity to ask them.
Yeah.
As you're distinguishing between the hysterical personality and the obsessive personality, are these to be understood by us as heuristic categories, not really necessarily that we're going to find just a hysterical personality or just an obsessive personality, but that people might have blendings of both in various degrees?
It's a very good question. You do find some people who are good examples of one or the other. There's no question about that. And this man I use as an illustration here, and the Indian American woman I use as an illustration, they are actually pretty good examples of what close to a pure form of this kind of personality organization. But what I said at the very beginning about these being reference points, they really are good reference points. You know, like on a map here, you have New York, you have Tampa, you have Chicago, you have San Francisco, but people are not necessarily in those particular places. They are somewhere, somewhere in those places, but a lot of people are, in some reference or related location. So these are reference points. There's definitely that's really true. And so, of course, you see people with mixed neurotic pictures. I think to understand this dynamic, though, even in somebody where there are some obsessive-compulsive elements or other elements, can help you to understand that ego style, that ego attitude, that can be helpful.
Mm-hmm.
So it's sort of yes and no. There are people like this in pure form, but there are people, who are really mixtures. Yeah.
Well, two things. One, your discussion of different groups and the locus of control being the locus of control is outside the person. It seemed to be that Scientology, with its belief in previous lives, is just perfect for this. And it makes sense, the population that they have. And then the other one is that I was really intrigued by your correlation between addiction and hysteria. Because, here's a group of people that have the locus of control is also considered outside.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. First about the Scientology point, I think that Scientology and consider it to be a cult, cults in general, are sort of situations or groups in our society that can be ones that a hysterical personality can use to feel passive and controlled by, no question about it. The issue of an addiction is interesting too, because I think one has to be careful. There are, in my opinion, true addictions, but I think you're talking here about somebody, for example, who has in a psychoanalytic framework would have some very significant pre-Oedipal, oral, difficulties. Someone who's operating on a need gratifying basis, for example, and for whom supplies are so vital. And that's something which I think plays a really important part in true addictions. But the hysterical personality can use that whole psychological concept, really, then to play out an experience of being passive to, quote, my addiction or my syndrome or something that is being discussed in the culture. A patient, for example, who was talking about a relative of hers who heard from a friend about the friend's sudden recovery of memories in some therapy. Well, all of a sudden, my patient's sister, she had it then too, and had remarkably similar, oh yes, me too. Feeling passive to the experience, identification with a friend, feeling taken over by the memories. Those are all hysterical personality kind of tendencies. So, with all these things, I don't want this to be misunderstood as saying there's no such thing as, even say, a multiple personality. I do think there are rare cases of multiple personality, very severe dissociative kind of trends. But there are ways in which, again, the hysterical personality can take over this kind of idea because of the hysterical personality's in tuneness with such things and play out on a neurotic level, kind of character, attitude, myth of passivity. Good questions. Yeah?
I wonder if because of epilepsy being an actual medical disorder, I wonder if that's why there still are some hysterics that have pseudo-seizures and then can say, well, this is epilepsy.
Yeah, sure.
Because we at St. Joseph's Hospital, where I used to work, every once in a while we'd see someone who was really a hysterical personality, I think, because they would go into these seizures, and they'd be pseudo-seizures, and then some event could draw them out of them in the middle of them, unlike what could happen with a real epileptic seizure.
Yes, yeah. Freud had a concept of somatic compliance. I don't know if you know what that concept is, which is that a hysterical conversion symptom, he felt, usually takes root when there is an actual physical problem in some organ or some organ system. So that a previous, kind of throat disorder could give rise to some hysterical problem with swallowing or with hysterical coughing. That the idea that there can be something somatic going on that then becomes the occasion for the use of it for some other purpose. I anecdotally with some patients have seen this with certain upsurges of back problems, certainly with upsurges of certain digestive problems, but there are ways in which this can be definitely actual physical disease can lead to this. Also, the whole point about how the hysterical personality chooses, and I want to emphasize here, chooses unconsciously. This is an unconscious process. Has a lot to do with what the environment will accept, what it will consider to be a kind of acceptable illusion of the symptom. That's why in certain neurologists' practices or internist practices, it can still be a currency that's used. And so much to do with that kind of sense of what's going to work here. But I do want to highlight that it's an unconscious process because hysterical personalities have sometimes been the object of a lot of scorn, and they're confused with malingerers. Oh, you're just, and talk with your average medical student, they have all kinds of derogatory terms to talk about somebody who has non-organically based somatic symptoms. This is an unconscious process. You're not using Freud's structural theory. It's an unconscious defense, an unconscious set of mental mechanisms that leads this to happen. So, yeah.
The other comment is that I have a lot of friends who are medicine men, just like a lot of friends who are priests and pastors and stuff like that. It's always, you're right, all medicine people I know, they are seen as conduits. They feel their powers are derived from something else. They do not have any power themselves intrinsically. And so that's a distinction, which makes me wonder what people in society think that they do themselves own power and can transmute power, because that would be different from this.
Say the last part again.
Which makes me wonder if the people that the healers that I know are people who feel that they are conduits.
Yes.
Okay.
Right.
Then are there groups of people who feel that they themselves have power?
Absolutely.
And who are these people?
Well, how about
Like
dictators?
Wiccans?
How about dictators?
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
How about-
That's an
How
example.
how about the people who are the heads of cults?
Okay,
You know,
I can see what you're
There's
saying.
actually a very interesting book by a man named Hansen on the Salem witch trials.
Mhm.
His rather kind of dramatic argument is that there were such a thing as witches.
Mm.
What he meant was he had some historical evidence that there were women who had dolls that they stuck pins in. Right?
Mhm.
They actually did this, okay, and they found these. And in the context of that culture, those women thought they were doing great damage.
Mm.
And in a weird psychological way, they were, because, of course, there was the belief that that could have magical powers, and then these hysterical victims. I want to highlight that it's not the witches who were the hysterical personalities, but the victims.
Yeah.
So his argument is that these women were actually trying to wield power within that cultural context and that set of religious beliefs.
Well, along those lines, because I've worked there a lot, I got to see the cemetery and talk to people, locals. But the newest theory is that the way that they made bread, particularly with the rye, there was something of a fermentation. I can get to this paper. The fermentation process that lends itself to hallucinogenics. And so what they're finding is that the women were baking the bread, and here they are just immersed in these hallucinogenic bread and water and stuff, and now that's what they think that caused
Interesting.
the people to have these visions. And then but the culture, you're right, determines how acceptable that is, and they blame the other ones, and they became locus of control was outside, was external.
Yeah.
Actually, some years ago, I read some papers, I don't remember where, but in the Caribbean,
Mm-hmm.
there are a lot of beliefs in this kind of magic and witchcraft and things like that. And some people study some cases of people that actually died
Yeah.
as a result of having been kind of targeted by one of these powerful persons with the needles and some they put it through their heart, and they actually did die. In that culture, that can be a very powerful suggestion that leads sometimes to death, apparently. So I'm not surprised by it. The power of the omnipotence of thoughts and magic and so on can be awesome, particularly in certain cultures where people have somewhat of primitive level functioning still, and some primary process thinking in a way, and not always completely logical and so on.
I was doing my research originally on this. I read some accounts of, what they described as voodoo death, and both by individuals, but also when the group ostracizes somebody, and that can lead to death, and also to lead to illness as well, physical illness. That's just a fascinating area, this mysterious leap from the mind to the body, how that happens in these cases. But
In my own tribe, my father used to always tell me since I was a kid that about how people, this amazed me, how people would say that today was a good day to die, and they would literally go off to die. And that was it. And so I think that there are different mechanisms for that, but one of them is would certainly fit this hysterical paradigm very well.
One comment, Alan, that you may find of interest, but I wonder if you would. Once I wrote, as you know, a book on female sexuality and the Oedipus complex, where obviously Hysteria is all about the Oedipus complex, as you quite rightly say. But obviously the Oedipus complex of boys and girls are very different, and one of the women is extraordinarily complicated by comparison. But I was wondering if one went to think in terms of what they have to accomplish. You see, for a while they are like a little boy, and even affect the mother as a little boy will. That's the first stage of the Oedipus complex. And the girl, where the boy stays, and that's it, that's his Oedipus complex. The girl has to change in a variety of ways. She has to enlarge her erotogenic zone. She has to change from a masculine position to a feminine position. And she has to change from the object she has chosen, the mother, to the object father. And I wonder if you were to look at these three different lines of development and look for examples, if one can find kind of sub-varieties of hysterical phenomena that are based more in a fixation to one of these lines than to the other. I don't know whether that
Well, actually, your work is included in my book.
Yeah, I know.
Actually, and that chart, and I spell some of these things out. I mean, I do. One of the things that I think is really important, I find it really crucial, is the way in which the Oedipus complex, in very particular forms, shows itself in the adult personality. I think that's really important, right? And I spelled out some examples of how a particular active, passive, and object choice difference. And I don't know if you're familiar with Dr. Navarro's book on this, but it's, I think, extremely valuable because it separates out libidinal position from object choice.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a really important thing. And many writers just conflate those things, and it really helps you to understand individual patients in terms of homosexualities, but also just within heterosexual people, the ways in which an active-passive, dimension is there, and then the object choice dimension, and that they're separate. And so I think that's really crucial, right, in terms of what specific kind of hysterical personality you're dealing with. The thing that would unite them as hysterical personality organization, in my opinion, is the use of this myth of passivity. And so someone who has gotten fixated more in the active phallic phase, a female, say, an active phallic, would be less likely to be an hysterical personality because there is more of a kind of need to be active, and not to feel overtaken by passive two forces outside of her control. And let me highlight too, this is an internal, unconscious, as well sometimes as conscious illusion of passivity. There are examples of hysterical personalities being very active and feel manipulative to the people around them. They can feel aggressive. They can feel like they're playing games. That they are, all those things. And because that is what they're unconsciously enacting. The Dora case, of Freud's. She was a teenager. She wasn't a fully developed adult personality, but you find in the Dora case examples of very active efforts on her part in connection with Freud. But it was, in many ways, she shows this kind of myth of passivity. And incidentally, that's another case where looking at the specific nature of the Oedipus complex is very instructive because you can see some of the active phallic elements in her. And I wrote a paper on this some years ago, reanalyzing that case. While Freud understood a huge amount about her, this active phallic competitive element in her, which makes her, not the pure form hysteric, but that those active phallic elements were not understood by him in the transference and led him to some countertransference reactions of feeling annoyed with her and refusing to take her back into analysis when she returned. So